The sea had been breaking itself on that coast for longer than anyone could remember, but the station was new enough that the paint on its railings still looked fresh when the first winter storms came. It was a low building, more a box than a house, set back from the cliff by a strip of gravel and brown grass. Antennas leaned from its roof. A short metal tower with a blinking light marked the edge of the world for ships that strayed too close. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of salt, old coffee, and the dust of paper charts. Most days there was only one person in the observation room. He sat at a wide, slightly scratched table facing the big window that looked over the bay and the open water beyond. Screens and instruments hummed softly around him, but his hands reached for the same things over and over: a pair of heavy binoculars with worn rubber grips, a pencil, and the map spread in front of him. His job was simple to explain and hard to live inside. He watched the sea. He watched its ice, its currents, its moods. He logged wind and swell and the slow retreat of the frozen skin that had once held the bay almost solid through long winters. He marked the routes of passing ships, the appearance of drifting debris, and sometimes, when the weather allowed and the sea felt generous, the movements of whales far out along the line where the color changed from gray to deep blue. One morning near the end of the cold season, he noticed the seal. At first it was only a pale shape on a small piece of ice, close enough to shore that his eyes picked it out even without glass. The floe was not much larger than a room. Its edges were rounded and thinned by countless small waves. On top of it lay a young seal, mottled gray and white, like a piece of cloud that had fallen and changed its mind. The animal was sleeping. Its body curved slightly, flippers tucked close, head turned a little to the side. Breath rose from its nostrils in small clouds in the cold air. From the window, the observer could not hear it, but he imagined there was a soft wheeze with each exhale, the sound that always seemed to come from seals when wind pressed against their chests. He watched for a while, more from habit than from any sense that the sight was special. Seals hauled out on ice when they could. They napped. They slid back into the water when they were ready. The sea tolerated their little habits the way an enormous animal tolerates the weight of a songbird on its back. Later, when his log came up empty on that day's notes, he found the moment and wrote a single careful line. Young seal on small floe near inner marker. Resting. By the time he looked again, the light had changed. The sun was higher. The bay had shifted under invisible wind. The piece of ice was farther from shore. The seal still slept. The floe turned slowly, as if thinking. It drifted out and a little to the side, following the lazy pull of the outgoing tide. The observer noted its new position on his chart with the tip of the pencil, a small cross on the pale blue. Then he went back to instruments, to numbers and graphs, and the business of being a reliable witness for people who would never see this room. Only when the day began to lean toward afternoon did he check again. The floe had moved. It should have been further out. Wind and tide together had been pushing in that direction all day, emptying the bay, dragging streaks of broken ice along like spilled white paint. Yet the small piece with the seal on it floated closer to the inner curve of the shore than he expected, as if some hand had turned it gently and nudged it another way. He frowned, raised the binoculars, and focused. The seal was still there, still sleeping. One flipper twitched occasionally, as if chasing something in whatever passed for dreams in a seal's mind. The ice beneath it glistened with meltwater that refroze in ridges along the edges. He could see where the floe had thinned, where the sea had already bitten into it. The next morning, he checked for it before looking at anything else. The floe was there. Smaller, a little more chewed by the waves, but there. The seal lay in almost the same position, though now one flipper hung over the side, trailing close to the water. He marked its position on the chart. Then he watched the other ice. Out in the wider bay, the season was changing shape. The larger sheets broke, cracked, and slid away. Longer streaks of open water appeared between them. Dark fingers of sea clawed inward, splitting white surfaces that had once felt permanent. As the hours passed, most of the ice that had lingered near shore pulled slowly outward, carried by tide and wind toward the open water. The small floe with the seal on it began to go with them. It drifted farther from the cliff. It turned and straightened and turned again. The observer watched through the binoculars, then glanced down at his instruments. Wind steady. Current direction unchanged. Nothing unusual written in those numbers. Yet when he lifted the glass again, the floe no longer pointed in the same direction as the others. The larger pieces moved with the simple logic of water. They followed lines carved by force and history, slipping into channels that had been waiting for them since long before this station existed. The seal's floe seemed to move along those lines for a while, then hesitate and slide sideways. Not back to shore. Not yet. But away from the open mouth of the bay, away from the place where the broken ice eventually became nothing but water. The observer watched this once, then twice, then the third time with the particular focus of someone who has just begun to suspect that something small may be important. He checked his instruments again. He looked for explanations. A submerged bar. A shallow where the current parted around an invisible obstacle. A stray line of debris altering the pressure. Sometimes there were reasons like that, quiet and unremarkable, that changed the path of one thing while leaving another untouched. Whether he found a perfect explanation or not, the scene in front of his window did not change. Each day, the ice thinned. Each day, the seal slept, woke briefly, scratched at its sides with hind flippers, lifted its head to look at nothing, then lay back down. Each day, the small floe drifted out with the others until, at some unmarked point, it slid sideways and a little landward, as if caught by an invisible palm. In the evenings, when the light went low and yellow, and the shadows of the cliff stretched long over the gravel, the observer could find the seal's floe closer to the curve of the bay than strictly made sense. He began to log it. Small floe with young seal remaining near inner curve. Outer ice moving out. Floe again deflected toward shore, despite outgoing tide. Seal appears to be using floe as regular haul-out. No obvious adult nearby. He did not write down the thought that came and went in his mind like a wave, that the sea itself seemed unwilling to let go of this one small life. On some days, the wind came hard, and the bay grew teeth. Whitecaps bit at every surface. The larger ice broke into smaller shards, then into slush, then into nothing visible. The floe with the seal pitched and rolled. The observer watched its edges crumble. He watched the seal wake fully for the first time and lift its head in alarm. The animal's eyes were dark, wet, and full of confusion. It slid forward on the ice, snout close to the water. The waves slapped against its temporary island. For a moment, it seemed to consider diving off and leaving the ice altogether. Then a broad, slow swell rose from deeper water, smoother than the sharp chop around it. It lifted the floe as gently as a hand lifting a bowl. The pitching eased. The ice rode over the smaller waves with a calmer, longer motion. The seal settled. From inside the station, the observer could see this as lines and shapes, as the interaction of masses and forces. Still, something in his chest answered with a quieter understanding that did not need numbers. He remained at the window longer than usual that day. Binoculars held so long that the strap bit into the back of his neck. By late afternoon, when the worst of the wind had shifted, the floe had wandered close enough to the inner bay that he could almost imagine wading out to it. The seal lay once more in its curve, eyes slit against the last of the light. The observer thought about going down to the shoreline, about calling someone or making a plan. But the shore at the base of the cliff was treacherous, a narrow tongue of rock and wet weed. The water between it and the seal's floe carried a cold that did not care about good intentions. Any rescue he could improvise from here would be more theater than help. He stayed at his post and watched. Over the next days, the pattern held. The sea continued its quiet work of erasing the winter. Shore ice melted into slick bands of water that rose and fell with each tide. The floating pieces in the bay grew thinner and fewer. Open water widened like a mouth. The seal's floe shrank. At first the change was subtle, a few less handspans of ice at the edges, a softer curve where once the shape had been more solid. Then the losses became clearer. The floe no longer looked like a small island. It looked like a raft made of memory and stubbornness. The seal adapted as best it could. It slept curled tighter. It learned the balance of the narrower platform, shifting its weight against each longer roll. Sometimes it lay flat on its belly, nose almost touching the meltwater pooled on the surface, eyes half closed as if trusting the ice and the sea and everything in between to keep doing what they had done so far. The observer began to know the seal. He watched the way the young body moved when awake, the way it scratched with one flipper and then the other, the way it stretched its neck to sniff the wind as if sorting smells into useful and not. He watched the patterns of its waking and sleeping, the times it seemed to linger at the edge of its little world and stare at the dark water, as if the thought of leaving it entirely were something too big to consider. He gave it no name. He was older than that habit. But when he wrote about it in the log, the lines grew longer. Young seal still on floe, ice now barely larger than the animal itself, bay almost clear. Floe continues to move outward in the morning with tide and wind, then is pushed sideways and inward by swell in the afternoon. Pattern holds. Sea state enough to break similar ice, but this piece remains in one part. He found himself tracking not only the visible movement, but also the way the water moved in the space beneath it. Sometimes, through the binoculars, he saw the darker lines of stronger currents below the surface. They curled around rocks and the ghost shapes of submerged ice. They slipped under some floes and alongside others. In that shifting web, the path of the seal's ice seemed too gentle to be entirely chance. It was not that the sea was kind. He had watched it take many things. He had seen logs rolled end over end and thrown back onto the shore like bones. He had seen birds blown off course and vanish into fog. He had watched storms peel away whole slices of beach and leave nothing but raw, damp rock. Yet he had also seen moments when its immense, blind strength rearranged itself around some small, soft thing and let it pass untouched. The seal's floe became one of those moments. One morning, just before sunrise, a mist came in and folded the bay in half. The horizon vanished. The world ended that day at a line a short distance from the cliff, where the pale gray of air and the darker gray of water met and tried to become the same color. The observer sat at his instruments and listened to the soft ticking of the station. He mapped the shapes of invisible hazards on his screens. He moved between radios and charts like a careful spider in the center of a web. Somewhere out there, ships needed corrections, warnings, reassurance. Only when the daylight had fully arrived and the mist thinned enough to show the first sharp details of the opposite shore did he lift the binoculars and search for the seal. For a minute, he saw nothing. The water was almost empty of ice now. Only a few small pieces drifted like crumbs. He scanned slowly along the curve of the bay. Stones, kelp, the uneven dark line where the sea chewed at the land. Then he found it. The floe had changed shape again. It was no longer a circle or an oval. It was a narrow, irregular tongue of ice, barely wider than the seal's body. The animal lay along its length, as if trying to cover as much of it as possible. The floe had drifted closer than ever before. It floated near the inner shore, in water shallow enough that the observer could see lighter patches where rocks rose just under the surface. Waves lapped lazily at its edges. A few more hours in this warmer, sheltered part of the bay, and the ice would be nothing more than a story for the currents to tell each other. The seal woke. It lifted its head, blinked, and sniffed. The air carried new smells here: mud, wet stone, plants, the old, heavy scent of land. The animal drew in that air with slow curiosity. When it slid forward and let its front half drop into the water, the floe rocked but did not overturn. The seal swam a short, cautious circle around it, then came back and hauled itself up again, as if checking whether the sleeping place was truly ending. The sea answered not with words, but with small, practical gestures. A thicker swell rolled in from the mouth of the bay, bent around the unseen shapes of the bottom, and arrived under the floe as a firm, upward push. It lifted the ice a little closer to the shore. A second, smaller wave followed, nudging it still further. The floe bumped softly against a half-submerged rock. The seal looked toward land, then toward the open water. It shifted its weight, as if weighing choices it did not have names for. The ice under it made a faint cracking sound. One, the observer, could not hear, but could imagine in the way cracks appeared along the white surface. When the seal slid finally into the water and did not climb back, the floe did not follow it out. A fresh line of swell pushed along the shore, then curled around the weakening ice and pressed it gently against the rock, holding it there as if saying that its work was done. The seal swam in tight circles at first, as if its body had forgotten how wide the world truly was. Then the circles widened. It tested its strength, diving and rising, moving closer to a cluster of other rocks where darker shapes waited. The observer raised the binoculars higher, adjusting the focus until those shapes resolved into other seals. They were older, thicker through the neck and shoulders. Some watched the newcomer with mild interest. Others lay draped over stones like soft, breathing bags, eyes closed, indifferent to anything that was not immediate warmth or threat. The young seal approached, then slowed. It tread water, only its head above the surface, whiskers dripping, eyes bright and uncertain. One of the older seals slid into the sea with lazy grace and moved toward it. Their noses touched briefly. Their bodies circled each other once, twice. Then the larger seal turned and headed back to the rocks. The younger one followed. It hauled itself up beside the others, found a small empty space on the wet stone, and settled there. The sea washed over them all, again and again, the same for each body regardless of size or age or story. On the chart, the observer drew one last small mark for the floe and wrote another line. Floe grounded and melted near inner rocks. Young seal joined group on shore. He could have left it at that. Yet his pencil hovered for a moment longer, then moved. Strong impression that local swells and near-shore current repeatedly prevented floe from leaving bay. Same pattern as previous days. Sea refused to let go. He sat back, listening to the quiet in the room. Outside, waves kept climbing the stones and rolling back, the way they had done before he came and would continue to do long after the logbook turned to dust. The bay lay open and almost free of ice. The cliff held. The station hummed. Now and then, in the weeks that followed, when his eyes wandered from instruments or when his bones ached from sitting too long in one position, he searched for the young seal among the rocks. Sometimes he thought he saw it, a slimmer body among the thicker ones, a particular way of lifting the head to sniff the wind. Sometimes he could not be certain. Seals, like waves, were easier to tell apart when you watched them every moment. At a distance, they became a kind of moving pattern. The flow that had carried that life was gone. The ice was in the sea now, part of everything again. What remained besides the lines in the logbook and the memory in one human head was a sense that the sea, huge and indifferent and full of forces beyond any chart, had shaped itself, for a little while, around a single small body on a piece of melting ice, and had quietly refused to let it vanish into its depths. On calm evenings, when the light stretched over the bay in a long silver hand and the water lay almost flat, the observer sometimes thought of that. He would lift the binoculars, sweep them over the place where the floe had last rested, and then lower them again without writing anything. There was nothing to record on those days. The sea was simply itself, restless and steady, holding and releasing, letting go of many things, and now and then, for reasons no instrument would ever capture, keeping one living creature a little closer to shore than the straight line of the current would have chosen on its own.